Hi there, Steve Coffin here. Today I want to talk about Japanese particles. I see from exchanges on the internet and elsewhere that Japanese particles seem to cause problems for some people who are studying Japanese. At any rate, it is identified as a feature of Japanese that is, I guess, unique. When I studied Japanese, and I did it largely on my own, living in Japan, I was unaware of the term Japanese particles. Didn't know that this was an issue. I just read a lot, originally just in hiragana. We had this Naganuma series, which were these endless stories, including Momotaro and whatever, stories he could drum up, all in hiragana, which was tough going. And so I read those, and I'll show you later some of the other material that I used. And it became evident to me that in Japanese, a number of things were happening that were different from English. Word order, for example, the verb comes at the end. Even if they don't tell you that, fairly quickly you start to realize that. And that there were these little markers. So, watashi wa, Tokyo ni, like I wa, comma, Tokyo ni, in Tokyo, sundemasu. Verb comes at the end. Anata ga, and to be perfectly honest, there's a distinction between wa and ga. They have essentially the same function, and I think they're largely interchangeable. There's undoubtedly some explanation of how they differ. Eventually, you simply get used to using them in context. The wa is a sort of more definite affirmation of, say, watashi wa, watashi ga. It seems to be softer. I can't tell you more than that. No one has ever corrected me on it. So that's as so far as the wa and the ga is concerned. Now, if I'm giving a book to someone, hon, which is book, hon o, because the direct object takes the o, and anata ni is to you, and so forth. So there are a number of these little words, and they're not only those little words that come after the noun. So teburu, which is a table, table no is like apostrophe. Apostrophe S indicates possession, one of its uses. Table no ue ni, on top of the table. So that a lot of these little words kind of replace the prepositions in English. Call them particles, call them whatever you want. Again, if you want to Google for Japanese particles, there is an endless number of pages that will explain the complete list and what they stand for. But none of that is going to enable a learner to master these aspects of the Japanese language unless, nothing's going to help you unless you actually expose yourself to a lot of the language through listening and reading. So I just wanted to mention that when I started with Japanese, I read the Naganuma, all in hiragana, for it must have been 8 months or so. Just read. There was no audio in those days. And then, I can't remember what else I did, but in every language I have learned, there are certain items of content that I have loved and that have influenced my learning of the language. In the case of Japanese, of course, I had the advantage that I could read Chinese characters. And at some point, amongst the various bits of content that I found in Japanese bookstores, was this thing, Showa no Kiroku. Okay, now I would have bought this in the early 70s. It is a history of the Showa era. So it has all kinds of pictures and text here, and came with NHK's, the actual soundtrack of announcers. NHK, that's the Japanese National Broadcasting System, their, news stories of the day. And so you follow the history of the Showa era. I listened to these. I understood 20, 30, 40, 50%. I listened to it over and over again. It was a wonderful place to learn Japanese. So in all of this, I never knew there was such a term as Japanese particles. I just exposed myself to the language, and the brain has this capacity to get used to what's happening and to sort it out. Okay. Now, I think it's an advantage in the beginning to identify this is a verb, this is an adjective, this is a noun. So, because otherwise it's just noise. And we are moving right now. We have our programmers at Link are setting up a system so that the part of speech will be identified if you save a word. Okay, this is an adjective. That helps a lot. But after a while, that just gets blended into this gradual absorption of the language and an increasing familiarity with how the language works. And eventually, you don't need to worry about particles. And if you do have a moment of uncertainty about which particle to use, you can Google and you can find umpteen explanations. So, sure, if you're interested in looking up Japanese particles, you can find lots better explanations than I gave you just now. However, fundamentally, to become comfortable in using Japanese particles, or the subjunctive in Spanish, or, prepositions or pronouns in Italian, you just have to expose yourself to a lot of the language. There is no shortcut, in my view. So, there you have it. It may not be tremendously helpful, but I would encourage learners of Japanese not to focus too much on the bits and pieces, but to make sure they expose themselves to as much interesting, compelling content as possible. Thank you for listening. Bye for now.